Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here, the Three Tops Gamer, here to give you another awesome episode of my Worst to Best series. And this time we'll be tackling another one of my all-time favorite prestigious PlayStation exclusive franchises, which basically lifespan pretty much extended the entire length of my favorite generation of PlayStation, which just so happened to be the PlayStation 3. And we will be going over the Resistance franchise. Now, before we get into this ranking, if you haven't already, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to press that subscribe button to help grow the channel and help spread the word. And if you haven't already, also be sure to press one of the links down below so you can contact me on any of my social media outlets so you can talk to me directly. So, with all the formalities out of the way, let's jump right into the ranking of the Resistance franchise by starting off with the number 5 and the worst entry in the Resistance franchise. And it just so happens to be...
Ranked lowest on my list has to go to 2012's Resistance Burning Skies on the PlayStation Vita. Now, right out of the gate, this game is by no means bad in my opinion, and being developed for the Vita was actually a wonderful choice, taking advantage of all the improvements the Vita had over the PlayStation Portable in terms of graphics and gameplay. My biggest issue with it is that it felt just so basic, and being the very last installment in the franchise to be developed, not only didn't do a very good job at giving this game its own identity, but it sent the franchise out in a very underwhelming way. The story takes place just before the events of Resistance 2, right as the Chimera begin their invasion of the United States, and you will play as Firefighter Tom Riley, and while he and his fellow firefighters are responding to a call, they find themselves caught right in the middle of a Chimeran invasion. He then finds himself joining a small resistance group called the Minutemen, and from that point on, it's up to Riley and his small group of allies to do all they can to fight off as many Chimera as they can and understand the magnitude of the Chimera invasion of the United States. In my view, everything about this game's plot from beginning to end is just basic, as there are no real twists to throw you off guard, and for me personally, this is something that I have a problem with. The word that best describes this game is basic, and for an early installment that might be okay, but not 5 games in when you've had plenty of prior examples of developers that they could have learned from. What ultimately places Burning Skies as my least favorite installment is its lack of any kind of innovation despite being on such an impressive portable device. It lacks any kind of interesting story, thereby providing the game with no replayable value. Even the multiplayer didn't add anything to this game. And even with me being such a fan of this franchise, this is the one installment that unless you simply want to play this game out of curiosity, even I wouldn't recommend you go out of your way to experience. Ranked 4th on my list and the weakest within the primary trilogy of Resistance console games will have to go to 2008's Resistance 2. Now, this game to me serves as a perfect example of a developer making a series of improvements on the technical level, but in their attempt to change up the pace and overall feeling of the gameplay experience that one would expect, they ended up making a series of mistakes which overall for me somewhat outweighed its improvements, but only by a little. Now, the story this time around is not told in the same narrative fashion as the first game did, but instead is presented in a much more traditional format. Taking place immediately after the events of Fall of Man, Nathan Hale is taken into custody by the Special Research Project Administration, and it is here that he discovers that he is not the only one who is able to inherit the Chimeran virus without transforming. And now being placed into a unit of soldiers just like him, Nathan Hale must fight off the Chimera just as they are invading the United States and begin to prevent them from opening a portal that will allow them to gain an unlimited supply of Chimeran forces to completely overrun the planet. Now, Resistance 2 does do a good job at upping the stakes and bringing the fight here to the United States. There is a much higher variety of unique enemies this time around, and the weapon collection has also been improved upon. The visuals are incredible, and there's even a good number of boss fights spread throughout the game that are some of the most impressive fights that you encounter throughout the entire franchise. Where the problems start is with its narrative and some of the gameplay choices. On the narrative side, Nathan Hale as a character is completely one-note and uninteresting this time around. Now, one could argue that Nathan Hale didn't have much of a character arc in the first game, but when you take into effect the narrative style of the first game was going for, and the fact that that game was meant to set up the franchise, that is something that I could forgive. This time, there was no excuse for the story's pace for the gameplay to be as painfully slow as it was. The campaign story had a hard time of building things up, or even spending a good enough time developing other characters outside of Nathan Hale, and by the time the game eventually ends, I find that it kind of felt kind of sudden without having much build up to a critical moment that one could see coming by the halfway mark. The gameplay has also been significantly slowed down, and the removal of the local co-op play was really upsetting for me personally. Even the multiplayer didn't do much for me once I was officially done with the campaign. While a lot of people really dislike this game, I can't seem to push myself so far as to say it's a bad game, as there are a lot of redeeming factors. It just overall for me is a very heavily flawed sequel, which is what ultimately gives it the number 4 spot on my list. Ranked third on my list goes to one of my personal all-time favorite games that came out during the PSP's lifespan, and that is 2009's Resistance Retribution. Now, unlike Resistance Burning Skies, which in my opinion was nothing special, Retribution is a perfect example of a developer taking the limited resources that they had and doing more with less, and because of that, it made it a far more impressive game than it had any right to be. Now, like Burning Skies, Resistance Retribution also takes place between the events of Resistance 1 and 2, but this time you'll be taking control of Royal Marine Lieutenant James Grayson, who, right from the very beginning of the game, is forced to kill his own brother, who has been partially converted into a chimera, which means this game already has far more emotion in regards of struggle that Grayson will have to deal with throughout the game. And after Grayson, alongside his allies, is able to fight his way through the city of Paris, France, he manages to reach the Paris Tower and must destroy it, allowing the human resistance force to retake control of the city from the Chimera. Now, right from the beginning, the one thing that allows this game to stand apart from any other installment in the franchise is that, unlike all the others, which are all done from a first person's point of view, Retribution is done from a third person's point of view, which is a wonderful decision, because not only am I a much bigger fan of third-person views over first-person views, but I believe that when you take into account the developer's track record of games and have a better understanding of what type of games they are best at, it makes perfect sense that for them, making a first-person shooter game on the PSP would have been too difficult, so they stuck to what they were good at and simply adapted the gameplay story to their style of gameplay, and it really paid off. The gameplay is very easy to get used to, and with the enemy's AI giving you a respectable level of challenge, you can progress through the game at a pretty solid pace. The level design is also very familiar to the style that you would expect to experience for the Resistance franchise for the time, and the visuals are actually quite good for a PSP game in 2009, and even the soundtrack is pretty good to listen to when the action picks up. Overall, I really enjoyed playing this game, and while I personally would recommend it, I'm very unsure how many people would actually go out of the way to want to try it, but if you do, I'm confident that you will think it is well worth your time and effort. Coming in second on my list has to go to the premier title that kicked off the PlayStation 3 era and was the first installment of this franchise, which is 2006's Resistance Fall of Man. Now, being a release title for the PlayStation 3 and being the first in the franchise meant that Fall of Man had a tough task to fulfill, and I believe personally it did a great job establishing both aspects. Now, the story for Fall of Man in really the entire franchise is based around an alternative timeline where the planet is invaded by an alien species and different nations of humanity are trying to fight it off. Narrative-wise, while the story doesn't do much for its characters, and though it's not to say that every character in this game is one note, the narrative is told in a somewhat documentary style and is told from the perspective of British intelligence officer Captain Rachel Parker. And while she is not always with the main protagonist Nathan Hale, we do get to see from her perspective how Nathan is reacting to the Chimeran virus that has infected him, along with how certain events more than likely played out, which for me, as such a big fan of documentaries, was a unique style of storytelling that you don't really see much. The first God of War game back in 2005 for the PlayStation 2 did something similar to this, and I really quite enjoyed that style of storytelling too. When it comes to its gameplay style of being a first-person shooter, right from the get-go, Resistance Fall of Man had a lot of really great things going for it at the time. It has a very well balanced arsenal of both human and Chimeran weapons that you could use throughout the game. The enemy variety provided plenty of challenge, and each mission and map location was very distinctive, and having the option to play through this entire game on a co-op offline style is a major plus that a lot of first-person shooter games don't do. Though the driving and use of vehicles could have been seriously improved upon, and the music for this game is not very memorable, looking back at it, it seems to be a much slower, less intense version of 2016's Doom. But for a 2006 game, I think that many people, including myself, still believe that this game holds up, which would ultimately grant it the number 2 spot on my list. Ranked number 1 and my favorite installment of the Resistance franchise is without question the final chronological entry in the franchise, which is 2011's Resistance 3. To me, Resistance 3 really was the culmination of everything Insomniac had been building up to for the Resistance franchise over the past 5 years. After the somewhat underwhelming response of Resistance 2, they really wanted to give this series a good send-off, and they pulled that off with flying colors. The campaign this time really had the highest stakes because at this point in the timeline, the Chimera had ultimately already won the war, and their final plan was to freeze the planet, thereby killing the small amount of humanity's population that was left. Now playing as Joseph Capaldi, who ultimately was forced to kill Nathan Cole at the end of Resistance 2, is now recruited by Dr. Malakoff to go to New York and close a wormhole, thereby ending the threat of the Chimera here on Earth once and for all. When it comes to the narrative of Resistance, it really was never better than in this game. The stakes are higher than they have ever been, and the Chimera are a far greater threat now because they basically have total control of the planet. The character of Joseph Capaldi is a far better character than Nathan Hale ever was. Despite seeing one note in Resistance 2 and coming off a bit of an asshole, he is given far more depth and personality and certainly has a great deal of character development now that he is married and has something truly important to fight for. When it comes to the visuals, Resistance 3 is the best looking game in the franchise, and with its gameplay, I believe Resistance 3 is far more challenging than any other console Resistance game ever was. With Joseph no longer having the Chimeran virus in his body, he can no longer rely on the healing factor, which requires you as the player to be far more thoughtful with your movements, and can no longer rely on an all-out guns-blazing tactic which easily could get you through both Fall of Man and Resistance 2, but will easily and quickly get you killed here. I believe that the map design is far less linear than the previous installments, granting far more options to progress through each level. The action set pieces here are far more numerous spread throughout the game, and the enemy variety feels, though familiar at times, is much more aggressive this time as the Chimera are far more numerous than you ever thought they could be. And I believe the boss fights here are actually quite satisfying and challenging. Whether or not the developers were planning to end the franchise here or not is unknown to me, but being that this franchise kicked off the PlayStation 3 era, I always felt that it was best if it finished during the PlayStation 3 era. Not every PlayStation exclusive franchise has to jump to the next console generation to be considered a success, and this is a clear example of that. Many other franchises don't really know how to properly end their story to the point where it feels like it has a satisfying conclusion, but I believe Resistance 3 is one of the rare examples where they managed to pull it off, which is what ultimately makes it my favorite entry in the franchise.
And that concludes my worst to best ranking of the Resistance franchise from Insomniac. Now, if you, like me, are also a fan of the franchise and are sad that it is currently gone, I would love to hear how you would rank all of these games. Be sure to share your list with me and everyone else in the comments down below, and as I said at the beginning of the video, please do not forget to give this video a thumbs up and spread the word. And if you have any more ideas that you think would make for a great top 5s list or make for a great episode of worst to best, be sure to share those ideas with me also in the comments down below. Now, like always, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you next time.